The photographs landed on the dining room table before dawn. My father threw them hard enough that two slid off the edge. I was still dizzy from the night before. At the Aldrin Group banquet, a client named Voss had slipped something into my drink and cornered me near the private elevator. A delivery man had pulled me out before anything worse happened. But my father, Edmund, did not ask whether I was safe. He looked at the grainy images, me slumped against a man in a work uniform, guided through a side entrance, and his face went stone cold. My stepmother Celeste stood behind him with folded arms, wearing the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited for this exact moment. My brother Adrian leaned in the doorway with a small, satisfied smirk. Edmund said the company name was attached to mine, and that was a problem he could not afford. He said I would marry the delivery man by the end of the week. I told him I had been drugged. He raised one hand and cut me off. The room was completely silent. Then he said the words I have never been able to forget. He said, "A daughter is only valuable until she becomes a problem." I sat alone in the dining room after they left. The photographs were still spread across the table. I stared at them and felt something crack open inside me, not from that night alone, but from every year before it. I had watched my brother Adrian receive praise for average work while I outperformed executives twice my age just to attend meetings. I had built the Aldrin partnership almost single-handedly. Our textile division had grown 30% in 2 years, but my name never appeared in any press release. The credit always found its way to someone else. I had told myself recognition would come eventually. Sitting there, I finally understood how wrong I had been. This was not punishment for one bad night. This was the end of a plan that had always been in motion. They had been waiting for a reason to remove me. Then I heard it, Edmund's voice from his study, low and steady, telling Adrian that once Helen was gone, her division would transfer quietly to him. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I listened and understood for the first time with complete clarity exactly what kind of family I had been born into and precisely what they had been planning to do with me all along. The wedding happened 4 days later. No flowers. No friends. No dress chosen with care. Only a plain gray one Celeste selected because she said it suited the occasion. The witnesses were strangers Edmund had hired. The man I was being forced to marry was named Elias Rowan. He was a wine delivery man from the countryside, quiet and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and careful eyes. Before the ceremony, he spoke to me quietly. He said he had not asked for any of this, and was sorry it was happening. I turned away. I was too furious and ashamed to accept kindness from a stranger I had decided to blame. During the ceremony, Celeste leaned close and whispered that a disgraced woman deserved exactly the kind of man she was getting. I kept my eyes forward. My hands shook when I signed the papers, but I signed them. When it was done, I made a silent promise that every person in that room would one day regret this. Then Elias touched my arm lightly and held out a plain, white envelope. He said quietly, "Helen, you need to know what really happened that night." I looked at it for a long moment, then took it from his hand. The envelope held 3 items, a hotel invoice, a security log, and a handwritten note. I read them standing outside the registry office, while the witnesses dispersed. Elias had been at the Aldrin banquet to deliver rare vintage wine. He had seen me near the elevator, barely able to stand, being guided by the client boss. He intervened. To limit the unfolding scandal, he took me out through the service entrance, not knowing photographers were already positioned outside. The invoice showed he had paid for a separate room using his own money. The security log confirmed separate check-in times. The note said he had slept on the floor and that someone from my family had paid off witnesses before morning. I stood on the pavement holding those pages and felt something complicated move through me. I wanted to believe it was a lie. Hating him was far simpler than accepting that he had saved me while my own family buried the truth. But each detail matched too precisely. The handwriting was plain and direct, not the construction of someone building a story. It was the writing of someone who had decided to stop carrying a secret alone and had placed it, deliberately, into my hands. We were sent to the countryside 3 days after the wedding, as though my family needed to erase me from the map entirely. My bank cards stopped working before we reached the highway. My company access was revoked. My assistant Petra had been reassigned. I discovered each of these things the way you discover damage after a storm, through small, humiliating failures one after another. Elias drove without comment, hands steady on the wheel. When we arrived at his house, I stood in the doorway and looked at the plain rooms, the rough garden fence. It was carefully kept, but nothing like anything I had grown up around. I directed all my anger at Elias. I told myself he was the symbol of my ruin, even though I already knew from the envelope that was not true. He was patient in a way that only frustrated me more because patience was harder to fight than cruelty. Then, about a week after we arrived, I started feeling ill every morning. I already knew what it meant before I took the test. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at the result, and instead of any warmth or wonder, I felt only cold terror and a resentment so deep it frightened me. Pregnancy did not soften me. It made me harder in ways I was not proud of. My body felt like the final proof of defeat, permanent evidence that I was chained to a life I had not chosen. Words spread through the countryside quickly. People recognized the Vale name. Some whispered. Even there, far from the city, I could not escape what that name now meant attached to mine. Elias worked longer hours without comment. He brought home fruit, medicine for the nausea, extra blankets. I accepted nothing graciously, waiting until he left the room before using what he brought. When our son was born in early spring, the midwife placed him in my arms and the room went quiet. I held him and waited for the feeling I believed I was supposed to have. It did not arrive the way I expected. I held him stiffly, ashamed of my own emptiness, telling myself I would do better once I had rebuilt something. I named him Micah. 1 week after his birth, a message came from Petra, my former city assistant, through an old backup account. Adrian was already in the boardroom presenting my strategies to the full executive team, word for word, as though he had built every single one of them himself. Petra's message lit something fierce in me. I pulled out my laptop, the one thing my family had not confiscated, assuming I was already finished, and began reaching out quietly to old contacts. Supply chain managers, former clients, people I had built real relationships with over years. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 small contracts. Within 6, steady income. Elias helped without being asked. He took Micah on his delivery routes in a carrier strapped to his chest, managed the cooking and household without complaint. I told myself I was grateful without ever showing it. I was too busy fighting to notice what I was costing my family in the process. Money began returning to the house. I felt my first real breath of relief in months. But I was missing everything else. Micah had started crawling, then pulling himself upright, then taking his first uncertain steps with his arms wide for balance. It was always Elias's hands he reached for. One evening I heard Micah laugh, clear and full, and call Elias something that stopped me where I stood. He called him my whole home. Those 3 words landed harder than any insult Edmund had ever aimed at me. 3 months later, I made a secret trip to the city for a small client meeting. When it ended, I walked past the Vale building out of a compulsion I could not explain, then slipped into a connected lobby where the boardroom was visible through glass. I stood there and watched Adrian present to the full board, confident, polished, clicking through every slide I had built myself. The board applauded. Director Hargrove, who had once called me the sharpest mind in the room, shook Adrian's hand warmly. I gripped the railing to stay still. Afterward, I found Felix from Legal, an old ally, in a nearby cafe. He could barely look at me. He said the family had been telling everyone that Helen Vale had suffered a breakdown, become unstable, chosen to vanish with a stranger. They had not simply removed me. They had replaced me with a story designed to make anyone who might help me look away instead. On my way out, a technician I vaguely recognized pulled me aside and said the banquet security footage had been deleted on a direct order from someone inside Edmund's office. He spoke quickly, as though the words themselves might cause him trouble. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. I came home from the city and pushed harder than ever, because anger was the only fuel that did not run dry. One rainy October evening, I was on a video call with investors when a sound came from outside, a high, brief shout, then nothing. I stayed on the call. 30 minutes later, Elias burst through the front door soaked through, carrying Micah against his chest. Micah was blue-lipped and limp. He had gone into the storm to find our dog Captain and fallen into the irrigation ditch at the edge of the property, which the rain had swollen to 3 times its usual depth. Elias had found him by the sound of the water moving wrong. The drive to the hospital felt like falling. I sat in the back holding Micah, counting his breaths. We sat outside the treatment room on hard plastic chairs while doctors worked. Then the doctor came out and said Micah would recover fully, but added that another hour in that water would have changed the outcome entirely. I pressed both hands flat on my knees and stared at the floor. Elias sat beside me, still soaked. After a moment, he covered my hand with his, and I did not pull away. I fell asleep in the hospital chair beside Micah's bed that night. Exhaustion took me before I could stop it, and I dreamed. In the dream, I had won everything. I had destroyed Adrian with evidence, walked back into the family mansion, and taken my rightful place. Edmund had looked at me with something close to respect. But as the dream continued, the rooms became empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Micah was grown and did not know my face. He looked at me the way you look at a polite stranger. No recognition, no warmth. Elias was not there at all. Just the approval I had sacrificed everything to earn, hollow in every direction. I woke up with tears on my face. The room was pale and still. Micah was asleep, breathing evenly. Elias was in the chair beside the bed, his neck at an awkward angle, with Micah's small hand loosely wrapped around one of his fingers. I sat in the dark and listened to both of them breathe. Something in me came loose very quietly, the way a knot releases when you finally stop pulling against it. I whispered into the dark, expecting no one to hear. I said, I became everything they trained me to be, except human. We brought Micah home 2 days later. That evening, after Elias settled him into bed and the house grew quiet, I stood in the kitchen doorway. He was washing the mugs from dinner, his back to me. I had rehearsed what to say for the whole drive home, but when I opened my mouth, none of the planned words came. Instead, I said, simply, I'm sorry. Not for one thing. For all of it. He turned around slowly. I told him I had used him as somewhere to put pain that was never his fault. I told him I had watched him carry everything and chosen not to see it. He did not rush to say it was fine. He was quiet for a moment, then said, gently but clearly, Helen, saving a family means showing up before it is almost too late. The word almost sat between us. Then I went to Micah's room and knelt beside his bed. He was not asleep. He looked at me with his father's patient eyes. I told him I did not yet know how to be the mother he deserved, but that I wanted to learn and that I was staying. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, Does that mean you'll be here in the morning? I said yes. He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. Something shifted between Elias and me in the weeks that followed. Not quickly or perfectly, but the way seasons change gradually, then unmistakably. I started seeing the countryside differently. On his delivery routes, I noticed things I had been too bitter to register before. Small family vineyards with hand-painted signs. Farms where 3 generations worked the same soil. And everywhere, the same slow grinding problem. Good producers being crushed by unfair contract terms, losing land their families had worked for decades. Elias knew every road, every grower, every loss. He knew which families had sold and which were barely holding on. I began asking questions, first casually, then seriously, taking notes on my phone. A picture formed slowly, but clearly. Vale Distribution controlled the regional contract structures through subsidiary arrangements. They were not simply benefiting from the imbalance, they were engineering it. One evening I spread everything across the dining table and showed Elias what I had mapped. He studied the pages carefully. Then he looked up at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something between caution and belief. He said quietly, If this works, Helen, they will not just notice you. They will fear you. We built the company from the dining table. We named it Rowan Vale Supply Partners, half his world and half mine, belonging entirely to the family we were choosing to become. Elias handled sourcing, farmer relationships, and logistics. He had trust in the region that would have taken me a decade to build. I handled contracts, strategy, financing, and positioning. We worked evenings after Micah was asleep, learning to disagree about timelines and margins without turning the argument into something older and larger. I was not a perfect mother during this time, but I was deliberate. Breakfast every morning. Stories at night. Sitting with Micah through his new fear of thunder, which had come after the ditch, telling him the rain was not his enemy. The company grew faster than either of us had expected. For months in, 11 local producers were signed. 6 months in, our first city distribution client. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, a legal notice arrived by courier. Veil Distribution was accusing 3 of our partner farms of contract breach and threatening to blacklist any grower working with us. My family had discovered that the daughter they discarded was building something real. And for the first time since they had sent me away, they were afraid. Adrian came himself. I had expected a lawyer. Instead, he arrived on a clear Tuesday morning in an expensive car that looked absurd on our road, wearing a boardroom suit among farmland. He sat at our kitchen table and offered me a relocation package, a quiet consulting role in another city, an apartment, and the implicit understanding that everything here would stop. He spoke the way he had always spoken to me, with the patience of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. When I said nothing, he turned to Elias and smiled the smile of someone who had already decided the other person did not count. He called him a delivery peasant who had gotten lucky when Helen fell from grace. Elias did not react. He looked at Adrian with calm, steady eyes. Adrian pushed the envelope toward me. I slid it back. I said no. His smile disappeared. He warned me that if I forced his hand, he would destroy the company and our marriage both. He was still talking when Elias stood and opened the front door in clear, unhurried invitation. Adrian left without finishing his sentence. As his car disappeared down the road, Elias said quietly that there was something he had been keeping. Something he had not been sure mattered until now. 3 years before we met, Elias had made private deliveries for a Veil subsidiary, sealed packages, no questions asked. He had filed most of it away and forgotten it. But one delivery stayed with him. He had brought a package to an elderly accountant named Mr. Briggs, who had worked for a Veil logistics arm before quietly disappearing from city work. Elias remembered the address because it was connected to a wine cellar his grandfather had once described. We drove there on a gray Wednesday. Mr. Briggs was in his 70s, cautious, and took a long time to decide whether to speak. When Elias mentioned the delivery, something shifted in the old man's expression. He led us through the cellar to a false panel in the far wall. Behind it were folders, copied records showing that Veil Distribution had been forcing small producers into debt through shell company pricing, then buying their land at collapse prices. Near the bottom, I found a memo dated 2 years before my exile. It recommended removing Helen Veil from the acquisitions committee because she had raised formal objections to the model. That was the real reason. That night someone broke into the cellar and set part of it on fire. I escaped with one half-burned folder bearing Edmund's signature on the cover page. I accepted an invitation to the Caldwell Charity Gala, the region's largest annual industry event, attending under our company name without any announcement. The reaction when I walked in told me everything I needed to know. Conversations paused. Faces showed the confused calculation of people who had assumed I was finished. Celeste found me first. She crossed the room with the ease of someone who had never lost and asked me, loud enough for others nearby to hear, whether country life had taught Helen Veil any humility. I smiled. I thanked her and said clearly that what it had actually taught me was how cheaply the wealthy sold their own daughters. The people around us went very quiet. Then I mentioned, lightly and in passing, the name of the Aldrin banquet venue. Celeste's composure cracked, just slightly, just for a moment. The flicker in her eyes was not the guilt of someone who had covered up what happened that night. It was the guilt of someone who had arranged it. I had spent months believing the banquet was a misfortune my family had chosen to exploit. What I understood now was that the misfortune had not been accidental. It had been constructed deliberately from the inside. The banquet hostess reached out 2 weeks after the gala. Her name was Aura. She said she had something to say before it finished eating her alive. We met in a cafe between the city and the countryside. She kept her coat on despite the warmth inside. She told me that on the night of the banquet, Celeste had personally redirected me into the private negotiation suite by dismissing the assistant assigned to accompany me. She told Aura it was a schedule change. But earlier Aura had overheard a conversation between Celeste and the client boss about my resistance to a merger term I had formally refused. The phrase she remembered was, "Let the client find a way." Aura also confirmed that Edmund's office had moved the following morning to suppress the footage and steer the story. They had not intended for Helen to be ruined, Aura said. They had intended for her to be made more compliant. The plan to manage me had spiraled into something uglier. I sat across from her and felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with my body. I had spent months desperately trying to earn my way back into my family, and my family had offered me up deliberately to secure a business outcome. Adrian struck lower than I had expected. 2 months after his failed visit, a story reached Micah's school through a boy connected to the Veil Circle. Micah came home confused and quiet. At dinner I asked what was wrong. He looked across the table and asked whether it was true I had been sent away because I was bad. The question found a place in me I had not known was still soft. I could have redirected him with something safe and polished. Instead, I thought of the women whose stories I had read on sleepless nights in the first year, the ones who told hard truths in plain language and built something lasting from the telling. I told Micah, in words right for a 4-year-old, that I had made mistakes, that other people had made worse ones, and that none of it had anything to do with him. I told him it was the best decision I had ever made, even during the long stretch when I had not been brave enough to act like it. He listened with his father's patience. Then he asked the question more precisely than anything Adrian had designed. He asked, "Are you staying now, Mama?" I said yes, not as a promise I would try to keep, but as a fact already decided. He placed his hand over mine and said, "Then I think we can fix it." The financing deal collapsed in February, not cleanly, but with a story attached. Anonymous claims spread through 2 industry contacts, saying our company was unstable and built on stolen supplier relationships. Both investors withdrew within 48 hours of each other. Coordinated. I sat at the dining table that evening and felt the old pull, the fear that my family's reach would always be heavier than anything I could build against it. Elias sat across from me without offering immediate comfort. Instead, he went to a cabinet and came back with a small green notebook. He set it on the table and pushed it toward me. Inside were 5 years of household accounts in his careful, even hand. Every sacrifice recorded, without drama. Every month, he had stretched a delivery route to cover the cost. Every tool sold quietly. Every meal skipped. He had been holding everything together in ways I had never stopped to examine. My throat felt tight in a way I could not immediately speak through. I asked him why he had stayed when I had given him so little reason. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Because I saw the part of you your family buried, Helen, and I kept waiting for you to come back for it." The opportunity arrived through Hargrove, the board director I had watched shake Adrian's hand months earlier. He reached out through a mutual industry contact, saying he had questions he needed to ask privately. He had begun noticing inconsistencies in Adrian's recent presentations, inconsistencies only visible to someone who had seen my original work. A second board member, Yvonne Carr, had also started asking questions. I arranged a presentation for both of them and 3 independent investors at a neutral office 40 minutes from the city. I prepared for 2 full weeks. The morning of the meeting, Adrian arrived with lawyers and a folder claiming I had stolen proprietary material before my exile. The room tilted for one tight moment. I let him finish. Then I opened my laptop. Original file timestamps, creation dates, and email threads, all preserved in my personal cloud account, maintained independently throughout my time at the company. Every draft predated my forced marriage by 7 months. The metadata was unambiguous. Hargrove and Yvonne looked at the screen, then at Adrian, then at each other. Adrian's lawyers began collecting their papers. Then Edmund walked in and said that if Helen continued, he would expose the truth about the night she lost her honor. I looked at him steadily. I said, "Please do." It took 3 more weeks to complete the evidence. Aura gave a formal written statement. The technician, a quiet man named Bex, had kept a backup of the banquet's deleted security index on a private drive. Not the footage itself, but the metadata log confirming the footage had existed and recording precisely when the deletion order was issued. Most critically, I had recordings of Celeste's own calls to me, made in the weeks after the gala, when panic had begun replacing strategy. She had been careful, but not careful enough. Across several calls, she had confirmed enough knowledge of the original plan to matter formally. The audio combined with Aura's statement and Bex's index did not produce a complete criminal case, but it proved setup, deliberate cover-up, and coordinated destruction of my reputation clearly and undeniably. That evening I sat with everything spread across the table while Elias put Micah to bed. When he came downstairs, I told him I was considering 2 paths: release everything publicly or file sealed legal notices targeting the contract fraud first, protecting the farmers before protecting myself. Elias said the farmers had been suffering for years and deserved to come first. I agreed. My legal team sent the notices before midnight. The collapse inside Vale headquarters did not happen overnight, but once it started, it moved with its own momentum. The sealed notices triggered a regulatory review. 3 shell companies traced directly to Adrian's management. He tried to push the blame to Edmund. Edmund's team moved to name Adrian solely responsible for the operational decisions. Celeste sent 6 messages over 4 days, progressing from cold formality to quiet fear to something close to desperate. I recorded every one. The press found the story through the public regulatory filings. It had a shape people could follow: a family company, a daughter disgraced and sent away, a pattern of fraud that had benefited the very people who discarded her. Adrian was removed from his position with his accounts frozen. At the board meeting, which I did not attend but received a full account of through Hargrove, Adrian sat at the head of the table and finally understood that the sister he had dismissed and worked to erase had outmaneuvered him from the countryside, using nothing but truth, timing, and the competence he had spent years claiming as his own. The vote to remove him was 9-1. Hargrove told me afterward that the one vote in Adrian's favor had been cast by Edmund. Edmund called me himself from his own number on a Wednesday evening. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. He said my name, Helen. Then came a silence. I had never heard from him. This was a man who had built a company over 40 years through absolute certainty, who had never once been unsure of the ground beneath him. He was unsure now. He said he wanted to discuss terms. There was a path to limiting the damage if I returned in a managed capacity. He did not apologize. He did not ask about Micah. He was offering the exact restoration I had once wanted so badly I would have done almost anything for it. I sat in the kitchen looking at the vineyard rows Elias and I had planted together in spring. I thought about the photographs thrown before dawn. I thought about the word problem. I thought about Micah asking whether I was staying. I told Edmund, calmly and without heat, that I was not returning to be a tolerated daughter inside a corrupt house. He started to respond. I said, I don't need anything from you. That's why I've already won. I ended the call, sat quietly, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time, complete stillness that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Celeste made one final attempt. She appeared at a regional industry event 3 months after the board meeting, looking older and carrying the specific brittleness of someone whose version of themselves has finally stopped working. She told me I was destroying my bloodline, that nothing I built would replace what the Vale name stood for. I felt no heat, not because I had forgiven her, but because she had become genuinely irrelevant. I told her quietly that a bloodline that fed on its own daughters deserved whatever ending it had built for itself. I smiled, walked away, and spent the next 20 minutes talking with a farmer from Brereton whose supply contract we had just renegotiated on fair terms. That same month, I launched the Rowan Vale Producer Protection Initiative, a fund to help regional farmers exit unfair contracts and access independent financing. The seed money came from the legal settlement. The legal settlement came from evidence my family had tried to burn in an old man's cellar. The farmers who had been losing land for a decade now had a formal resource bearing our names. And the name Rowan Vale meant something the Vale name alone had never meant, that someone had been through the worst of something and built something useful on the other side. 6 months later, I stood at an industry summit in the city, looking out at a room that had once dismissed or erased me. I spoke about supply chain reform, specifically and honestly. Near the end, I said that I had spent years trying to become the kind of daughter my family could love, until I learned that some houses are built so crooked they cannot recognize the truth unless it kneels. No one misunderstood. I left quickly. I had somewhere better to be. When I pulled into the property that evening, Micah came running between the vineyard rows before I had opened the car door, boots leaving prints in soft earth, Captain the dog bounding behind him. Elias was at the entrance gate checking a post bracket. He looked up and raised one hand, unhurried and completely himself. I stood still for a moment, taking in the sign above the gate, the name we had chosen together, not given by blood or forced by circumstance, but built word by word and season by season from something intended as an ending. My son ran into my arms. I held him and looked over his head at the land no one could take from us, at the life that had grown quietly and stubbornly from the worst day I had ever lived. The daughter they cast out did not crawl back for acceptance. Helen Vale built a legacy they could never own.